It's a real pleasure to be back with you all today. I understand you spent the morning talking about China, Sino-Russian relations, and now for the next hour or so, we're going to look from the other direction, from the West towards Russia. And what I thought I would do in my introductory remarks is focus on the challenges that the United States faced after the end of the Cold War, the way various American administrations thought of Russia and the actual policy that they put in place. So I want to take you back to start with the end of the Cold War. I mean, this was a period of tremendous triumph in the United States. We had, after 40 years of working against the Soviet Union, trying to contain the Soviet Union, in very rapid pace over the late 1980s, we managed to have a situation in which the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev moved away from communism, moved away from Marxism-Leninism, began to try to reintegrate itself into the global economy and the global political system in a way it hadn't been for 70 years, but then ultimately collapsed, leaving the United States as the preeminent power on the global stage with no peer on the horizon. And yet the question that the United States faced was, what are we going to do with this new Russia? A country that was in tremendous disarray, facing tremendous socioeconomic problems, high inflation, food shortages widespread throughout the countries. And yet, despite the breakup of the Soviet Union and the loss of a significant part of its population and territory, Russia still remained by far the largest country in the world. It had the richest endowment of natural resources. It inherited the lion's share of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. It received, as a legacy, the Soviet seat on the UN Security Council and the veto that accompanied that seat. And in addition, Russia was still located in the heart of Central Eurasia, able to project both power and pathogens into Europe, the Middle East, South Asia, East Asia, all the major zones of industrial activity in the modern world outside of North America. And we had still faced a Russian political elite that thought of Russia as nothing other than a great power and was determined to reassert Russia's prerogatives on the global stage and as quickly as possible ensure that other powers recognized Russian interest and Russian potential influence. Added to this challenge was the fact that the future of Russia was uncertain. Which direction was it going to go in 1991? Yeltsin had played a leading role in breaking up the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and 1990s. He claimed to be a Democrat. He surrounded himself with a group of so-called young reformers who wanted to move very quickly to put in place the elements of a market economy on the ruins of the Soviet planned economy. But at the same time, we recognized that Russia did have a long tradition of imperialism, and to make matters worse, there were still many sort of old communist, new-founded nationalists that had a tremendous amount of influence in this legislature of some sort, the Congress of People's Deputies. So the future was uncertain. Would it become democratic? Would it return to its authoritarian past? What would be the implications for the United States? And what the people in the George H.W. Bush administration had to deal with was how we're going to structure our relations with Russia in order to ensure that American preeminence would last long into the 21st century. Now, the Bush administration itself at that time remarkably did not spend a great deal of time focused on Russia after the triumph in the Cold War. The president was engaged in a re-election campaign and very quickly found himself engaged in a tough domestic struggle, which he ultimately lost in the fall of 1992. Other people in this administration simply didn't have the authority, the backing of the president in order to pursue with great vigor any sort of policy towards Russia. All that said, the administration did leave a basic framework for US policy towards Russia that endured for a quarter of a century. It provided the outlines for the policies that were pursued by the Clinton administration, the George W. Bush administration, and the Obama administration up until 2014, when Russia seized Crimea and instigated rebellion in eastern Ukraine, and the framework fell apart at that point. Now, this strategy had two main pillars. The first was probably the most important one from the standpoint of American administrations, and this formed what you might call the grand strategy of the United States for a quarter of a century, and that was to integrate Russia as a free market democracy in the Euro-Atlantic community. If the United States succeeded in doing that, it would take a step towards the creation of a Europe whole and free and at peace, would reduce to almost to zero the possibility of a new major conflict breaking out in Europe, such as the First World War, Second World War, or the Cold War itself. Conflicts that had demanded a great amount of American time, energy, blood, and treasure over the past 75 years or longer. So this is what the administration hoped to do over the next several decades. All that said, there was still concern about things going bad in Russia, and things would go bad in two ways. Initially, there was tremendous concern about spreading anarchy throughout Russia, throughout the former Soviet space, something that could have horrific consequences given the vast quantity of nuclear weapons, infrastructure to build weapons of mass destruction that was strewn across Russia and other republics of the former Soviet Union. The other was also very much in the minds of the Bush administration, and that is the return of Russia to its authoritarian expansionist past. And so while the administrations very much wanted to integrate Russia, they still thought that they needed to hedge against things going sour in Russia in the very near future. And this hedge came in three ways. First was the arms control. That is limiting or first securing particularly the nuclear material in Russia and elsewhere, and then reducing the arsenal as small a size as possible that would be consistent with strategic stability. So a way of ensuring that if things went sour in Russia, if there were chaos, there would be fewer nuclear weapons strewn across the country. The second aspect of this was the expansion of the Euro-Atlantic community eastward towards the Russian border, eventually including Russia, as Russia was integrated into the European system. For the United States, this took largely the form of the expansion of Nato in the 1990s and the 2000s and beyond. And the final element of this was what we would call geopolitical pluralism in the former Soviet space. That is encouraging and supporting the development of independent states all along Russia's periphery, in a sense to reduce the chances of the reemergence of a threat from Eurasia on the dimensions of the Soviet Union had posed for the past 40 years or longer. Now, as I said, each administration after the George H.W. Bush administration operated within this framework. So President Clinton came to office, and what he set out to do, in his own words, was to create a strategic alliance with Russian reform. George Bush comes in 8 years later, and his goal is to form what he called a qualitatively different relationship with Russia that moved beyond the Cold War. And then 8 years hence, we have President Obama, who comes in and puts into place a policy that is known as the reset. Now, each of these administrations did this with a specific goal in mind for the relationship with Russia. Clinton's, I think, was the most ambitious. What President Clinton wanted to do was to turn Russia into a junior partner of the United States, supporting the US-led international order, but particularly being supportive of US activities in and around Europe. George Bush came into office hoping that he could build a relationship with Russia that would allow the United States to deal effectively with the problems of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. In the first instance, to countries like Iran and North Korea. After 9/11 and the terrorist attacks, this turned into an effort really to deal with Russia as a partner against international terrorism, which clearly had implications for non-proliferation as well. And then finally, President Obama comes to office, and his great goal is, as he said, to build a world without nuclear weapons. And clearly, if you're going to do that, Russia, as the other great nuclear superpower, becomes a key and necessary partner in that endeavor. Now, the administrations also all believe that in order to pursue this type of cooperative relationship with Russia, broad scale, they needed to have a Russia that was moving towards democracy, that it had to be democratizing in some way if you're going to sell this to the American Congress and to the American public over the long term. And so they all describe the relationship with Russia and the various documents you saw issued certainly in the first 2 or 3 years of each administration as a democratic partnership of some sort. That Russia was making a perhaps slow but nevertheless successful transition to full democracy. And they did this despite obvious facts on the ground that suggested otherwise. If you looked at the situation in Russia during the Clinton administration, almost from the time Clinton assumed office, Yeltsin was taking steps that, to put it mildly, were suspect from the standpoint of democratic practice. One of his first acts was in his struggle against the Congress of People's Deputy, which led to the shelling of the Russian White House in October of 1993. He conducted a referendum on the Constitution that was flawed by most standards. It may have been free and fair, but I think in retrospect, it's clear that the referendum didn't meet the thresholds that were needed for the Constitution to pass. After that, you got a brutal war in Chechnya starting in the fall of 1994, and then a re-election campaign in 1996, in which the Yeltsin team pulled out all the stops, violated all the restrictions on financial limits and advertising limits in an effort to defeat a communist foe. Something similar happens with George W. Bush as he's talking about a partnership, a democratic partnership with Vladimir Putin. Almost from the time Putin enters office, he is taking steps to restrict the influence of autonomous centers of power in the Russian political system. He's taking particular aim at the media and closing down those that were most critical of Kremlin policy at that point. He makes a radical effort or a major effort to rein in the power of the regional barons across Russia, to tame the oligarchs and other such things. And then finally, if you look at President Obama, on one hand, he had a very congenial, I would argue, counterpart in President Medvedev, someone himself who talked about his commitment to democracy, wanting to modernize Russia, turn it into an innovation society. The problem was, as we all know, that Medvedev wasn't the key leader at that point. Power behind the throne was Prime Minister Putin at that time, and over the previous 8 years, he had already demonstrated less than a full commitment to Russian democratic processes. Now, each administration continued to maintain the position that Russia was moving towards democracy, that this was providing a foundation for U.S.-Russian strategic partnership. And that lasted as long as reality did not become so bad that you could no longer maintain that rhetorical stance. And each administration found that, reached that turning point at some point during its presidency. For Clinton, it comes in 1998 with the financial crisis, the collapse of the ruble, Russia's defaulting on its debt in August of 1998, Yeltsin's decision to dismiss a more or less reformist government and replace it with a government that is very close to the nationalist and the Communist Party. The prime minister becomes Yevgeny Primakov, someone who had worked very hard during the previous decade to build a multipolar world or multipolar Russian foreign policy in competition with the United States. And he selects as his first deputy to deal with the economy a former head of Gosplan, the Russian state planning agency for the economy. If you look at the Bush administration, 2007, you have this infamous speech that Putin gives at Munich in February of that year, making it clear that Russia itself is no longer in full integration with the Western world and is going to pursue an independent foreign policy. That is followed in August of 2008 by this very short war against Georgia and the declaration of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, or the recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states. And then finally for Obama, as we all know, 2014, Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. And this puts an end to the effort by each administration to pursue a policy of trying to integrate Russia and building a strategic partnership with Russia. So I think the question that we need to ask is, why did the United States pursue this policy of integration? In particular, why did the George W. Bush administrations and the Obama administration proceed down this path, despite the obvious failures of the other predecessors? Each president, Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama, in fact, left office with U.S.-Russian relations in worse shape than they found them, and with Russia no more integrated into the Euro-Atlantic community than it had been at the start of the administration. And I think there are a number of reasons as to why, and very good reasons as to why the administrations went down this path. If you think back to the late 1980s, the early 1990s, the end of the Cold War, it was really a time of tremendous optimism and exuberance in the United States about the possibilities for the American system, for liberal democracy around the globe. An American political scientist, Francis Fukuyama, wrote a very famous essay called The End of History, which made the argument that liberal democracy had become the sole sort of formula for national success going into the 21st century. Liberal democracy, the American system, had just defeated communism in the Cold War, and that came about 50 years after liberal democracy had defeated fascism during the Second World War. So if countries were going to thrive in the 21st century, the only option really was to adopt the norms and standards of liberal democracy, and that is very much the American system. This was reinforced at that time by the beginnings of a great wave of globalization, particularly on the economic side, produced in many ways by the revolution in information and communication technology that had its origins in the late 60s and the 1970s. To the mind of most people who studied globalization at that time, it was forcing on countries a certain set of economic standards and political standards, again, that were necessary thrive in the 21st century. And because the United States had played a leading role in developing the technologies and popularizing the idea of globalization, those norms, to a very great extent, also reflected in norms of the American political and economic system. And then finally, another element that encouraged administrations in their view was that in the early 1990s, we're also witnessing the ongoing what you might call third wave of democratization. It had begun in the 1970s with revolutions in Greece, Portugal, and Spain, and proceeded to much of Latin America. In the 1980s, by the late 1980s, it had already penetrated in the Soviet bloc, leading to the downfall of Marxist-Leninist regimes throughout Eastern Europe. And in 1990, 1991, it was penetrating into Russia itself. So the spirit of the times seemed to suggest that the moment was right for a Russian transition to free market democracy. Added to that, I would argue, was very much a psychological factor for the American presidents. And I explain it this way. You don't win a war simply by eliminating another country's military and defeating it militarily. Real victory comes when the other side adopts your system as the only appropriate one. This was the American experience in the Second World War, the crushing of fascism in Germany, the crushing of fascist imperialism in Japan, and then over the years, largely under American tutelage, the formation of liberal Western democracies in both Germany and Japan. And that sort of became the model for the way American presidents thought about what the United States needed to do at the end of the Cold War. That is, turn Russia into a country that resembled the United States in many ways. That would be the ultimate vindication of the US victory in the Cold War and the triumph of the American political system. And it also enabled American presidents to stand up in history as the equivalents of Franklin Roosevelt or Harry Truman in reforming the global environment. Now, you add to this a couple of other factors. One, I think the administrations believed they also had the intellectual tools that would help them find a way forward in working with Russia on a democratic free market transition. In the 1990s, we saw the blossoming of a whole new academic field called transitology, the study of how countries made successful transitions from authoritarian, totalitarian states into liberal democracy. You add to that a sense that the United States and its Western partners had a clear idea of how you went about reforming similar, planned economies to make them efficient market economies. And much of this was based on the experience and successful experience that the United States had had in dealing with the Latin American debt crisis in the 1980s. And the policies that had been pursued at that point became packaged in what was called the Washington Consensus, which was adopted by the U.S. Department of the Treasury, the International Monetary Fund, as sort of the boilerplate for making successful transitions to free market democracy in the late 20th and early 21st century. And then finally, I think administrations believed that they had material to work with in Russia in order to make this successful transition. In Clinton's case, it was Yeltsin, who Clinton saw as a genuine Democrat, a person committed to reforming Russia. Clinton said he may have made mistakes from time to time tactically, but he had a flawless sense of direction. For George W. Bush, it was a bit more difficult with Putin, but you could always rationalize the steps that Putin took initially that might appear authoritarian in spirit as necessary efforts to deal with the chaos that Putin had inherited from the Yeltsin period, and therefore providing the type of political order that you needed in order to build a genuinely democratic society over the long run. And in any event, President Bush decided very early on that if he embraced Putin, this would be the best way of encouraging the type of democratic reform that he wanted to see. And finally, as I've already pointed out, Obama had Medvedev, a democratizer in his own light, a modernizer. The problem was, of course, Putin behind the scenes. But I think President Obama believed that if he treated Medvedev as a key leader, if they could produce some mutual success, then he could turn Medvedev into a real leader of Russia and therefore lead to a brighter democratic future. Again, there were good, I think, reasons for administrations to pursue this path. Now, as to why President George W. Bush and Obama went down this path, despite the failures of the Clinton administration, Obama, despite the failures of the George W. Bush administration, I think is explicable by the fact that in order to maintain a partnership with Russia that all these administrations needed for geopolitical purposes, they needed to be able to claim that Russia was in fact democratizing, because it's very difficult to get the American public, the American Congress, to support a long-term partnership with a country that is not democratic, that does not share our values. You could do that for brief periods when the United States is facing an overwhelming threat from another country. This is the experience of Franklin Roosevelt during the Second World War, the ability to ally with Stalin's Soviet Union in order to defeat Nazi Germany. It's also the experience of President Nixon in the 1970s, when he formed a tactical alliance with China, Red China at that point, in order to deal with what was seen as the primary threat from the Soviet Union at that point. But absent that overwhelming threat, it's very difficult to sustain a relationship with an authoritarian power. And it was clear as a consequence of the end of the Cold War, American preeminence, the lack of great power competition, the absence of any other threat of such proportions that to the existence of the United States, that you wouldn't be able to sustain the public support for a close relationship with Russia unless you could make the argument that it was democratizing. And again, that also played a factor in why the three administrations went down this similar path. Now, as I said, they all had doubts that they would ultimately succeed, and so they did hedge. Arms control was a very important element of all three administrations. Clinton administration made a major effort that continued into the Bush administration to help secure the Soviet nuclear arsenal, the infrastructure to build weapons of mass destruction. All this was done under what was called the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, the Nunn-Lugar program. That was actually quite successful and actually welcomed by Russia, despite the fact that it was something of a hedge against Russia, in part because it allowed Russia to maintain its own strategic arsenal at a time when it was stressed financially. The Bush administration, the Obama administration, as we know, also signed major arms control agreements with Russia, the Moscow Treaty for the Bush administration, and the New START for the Obama administration. As I said, this hedge didn't cause much great problems with Russia because it helped them maintain their nuclear arsenal, and the arms controlling agreements that were bilateral, in a sense, validated Russia as the other great nuclear superpower, something that played to their sense of Russia's large role on the global stage. NATO expansion, as we all know, is another matter, and this became a major problem in U.S.-Russian relations from the very beginning. The Clinton administration came to office determined to expand NATO eastward. They wanted to do this in order to build a more secure environment in Europe, but as I also said, a hedge against a turn for the worse in Russia. Now, they tried to present this in a way that they could argue that this really wasn't directed against Russia. And so one of the things that they did was rediscover one of the additional purposes for founding NATO back in 1949. Primary purpose, as we all know, was to contain the Soviet Union. But a secondary purpose for the foundation of NATO was to reconcile former enemies on the European continent, particularly Germany and France, to prevent the reemergence, the renationalization of security policy that had laid the foundations for conflict in Europe in the centuries past. And so what the administration talked about when it talked about NATO expansion in the 1990s wasn't so much containing Russia as it was preventing the reemergence of conflict in Eastern Europe. And this was particularly important in the 1990s because all the tensions between Eastern European countries that had in fact been frozen by the domination from the Soviet period began to reemerge slowly as Soviet domination lessened in the late 1980s and into the 1990s. The NATO alliance, which remains fundamentally military in essence, also takes on a large political dimension for the Clinton administration, and that becomes an instrument for the extension of peace eastward. It also becomes a fundamental instrument for the promotion of democracy, because NATO membership would be made contingent on all candidate countries adopting certain democratic processes before they could join the alliance. The alliance at that point, 1991, 1992, was composed of all the members were democratic countries at that point. Now, in addition, in order to deal with the Russian concerns about NATO expansion, the Clinton administration also tried to give Russia some insight into how NATO functioned. So in 1997, we see the creation of the permanent joint council that brought Russia into the room with the then 19 members of NATO to sit down and discuss certain common problems and perhaps work out joint programs. So it was a way to give the Russians that the Clinton administration said insight into NATO, but no veto over NATO activities. And the hope was that that would mollify Russia in some way. But the administration, along with its NATO partners, also guaranteed that NATO would not place nuclear weapons in any new states. And finally, that they would not deploy what we call substantial combat forces on a permanent basis in any of the new member states. And then it proceeded to expand NATO eastward. First wave includes Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. The Bush administration comes into office intent on pushing this even more rapidly than we do in 2002, 2004, what we call the Big Bang, bringing in 7 additional countries, including the 3 Baltic states, former Soviet republics, along with Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, and Romania. And then the Bush administration, also very much encouraged by the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, that Ukraine and Georgia were also on a rapid path to democratic transition, trying to bring them into NATO. And this reaches its head in 2008 in the NATO summit in Bucharest, with the Bush administration working very energetically to give Ukraine and Georgia what we call membership action plans that would put them on a fast track to NATO membership. Resistance from France and Germany at that point. And the NATO summit decides not to provide the 2 countries with the membership action plan, plans, but rather says in his communique that Ukraine and Georgia will eventually become members of NATO. So not enough to satisfy Ukraine and Georgia, but certainly enough to irritate Russia. And Putin comes to Bucharest the day after the conclusion of the NATO summit to warn that Russia will resist expansion into the former Soviet space, and makes a particular point about Ukraine, saying that if Ukraine ever joins NATO, it will join without Crimea and without its eastern provinces, something that is a forecast of what we're seeing today. Geopolitical pluralism in Eurasia starts with the Clinton administration, an effort to support the development of democratic, free market, and independent countries all along the Soviet periphery. But it really reaches the high point during the George W. Bush administration, with a focus on developing the energy resources out of the Caspian Sea, pipelines that would circumvent Russia, a way of lessening Russian control over the energy resources of other former Soviet states. It comes in the form of pushing back against a plan that Russia had developed for the resolution of the Transnistria problem in Moldova. It comes from the support of American bases in Central Asia for the conflict in Afghanistan, well beyond the period that we had suggested to the Russians they would be necessary. It comes in the support of a organization called Guam, Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and Moldova, as something as a counterweight to the Commonwealth of Independent States and other organizations and entities that Russia had formed among former Soviet states on the territory of Eurasia. But the real sticking point for the relationship between the United States and Russia, and the one that poisons the entire relationship, really is Ukraine. The Orange Revolution enjoyed a tremendous support within the Bush administration. It was seen as a way not only of consolidating democracy in Ukraine, but also as a way of consolidating Ukraine as an independent state, and in a sense, slowly pulling Ukraine out of the Russian orbit into the Western orbit, something that was anathema as far as Moscow was concerned, particularly Putin, because all the plans that Putin had for the development of Russia, for the various entities he was forming in the former Soviet space, the collective security agreement, the Eurasian Union, for example, really didn't make strategic or economic sense without the inclusion of Ukraine. And so the tension built throughout the Bush administration and finally exploded in 2014 under President Obama. So we had the hedges. I think the administrations did these hedges in a way that they thought would lead to least resistance from Russia. They considered Russia to be weak at that point. And they thought that even with the Russian opposition, it would be very easy to push these things through. We found out to the contrary with the war in Georgia in 2008 and the events in Crimea in 2014. Now, since 2014, we've really had a policy that has been moving slowly towards what would be called a form of containment. The Obama administration very quickly changes its policies towards Russia after the events in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. It turns to those tools that the United States historically has used to deal with foreign challenges. It tries to isolate the country diplomatically. It uses sanctions to try to undercut its economic capabilities, particularly with regard to defense industrial conflicts, and it engages in deterrence, building up forces along borders and in other ways that hopefully will deter the other country. The Obama administration begins this very quickly after the events in Crimea in 2014. Now, it never bites as much as one would expect, and Obama never pursues this with full force. And I think for a couple of reasons. One is that Obama did have a fairly low assessment of Russian power at that point. And while he saw Russia as an emerging threat, he argued after the events in Crimea that Russia wasn't the top threat facing the United States. And in fact, he was more concerned about international terrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And that's where he was going to focus his attention. If those are your two sort of key national security threats, then you can't push back that hard against Russia, in part because Russia can be an element in dealing with both Iran and international terrorism. And in fact, that's what you saw in the Obama administration. After Crimea, there continues to be work on the Iran nuclear program. The JCPOA, the Joint Program of Action, is in fact agreed in 2015. Russia plays a critical role in the forging of that agreement. You also saw an effort to work with Russia to deal with the ISIS threat that was growing in Iraq and Syria in 2014, 2015, and 2016. And so we never get the really hard-edged containment policy that the United States had pursued during the Second World War. Trump administration obviously changes the atmosphere around U.S.-Russian relations because of the president himself wanting to build a closer relationship with Russia. His, I think, concern for developing a working relationship with Putin, his refusal to acknowledge the role that Russia had played in the 2016 presidential campaign. All this creates certain concerns about how President Trump wants to order his relationship with Russia. But if you're looking at the facts beyond what the president himself said and how the administration conducted whatever policy it put in place, it was very much a continuation of the latter stages of the Obama administration. The senior officials that Trump appointed took a much more negative view of Russia than the president did. The Congress put in place legislation, mandates on sanctions that limited what the president on his own can do to lift sanctions on Russia, and mandated further sanctions. And so the Trump administration, in fact, pushes even harder on Russia's diplomatic presence in the United States, limiting it further, shuttering consulates across the country. It increases the sanctions against Russia for various activities, interference in the election campaign, cyber attacks, and so forth. And so you get a much harder sort of containment policy under the Trump administration than you would have expected listening simply to the president himself. The Biden administration comes in intent on improving on the Trump administration's policy and certainly the president's presidential behavior. But it makes clear from the very start two key points. One, that the administration is not interested in a reset, so it doesn't want to rebuild relations with Russia. What it wants is, it claims, is a stable, predictable relationship with Russia that is largely going to be competitive. And the second point that the Biden administration makes is that Russia is not going to be a priority. It wants to have a relationship with Russia that allows the administration to devote the lion's share of its attention to what it considers the grave strategic challenge that the United States is facing in East Asia, and that is China. That, I think, would have been the administration's preference. Clearly, that did not sit well with the Kremlin. And the Kremlin, over the past year and a half, has undertaken steps to demonstrate that the administration cannot ignore Russia. It's taken steps to push back very forcefully against administration policy, American policy, more broadly speaking, for the past 25 or 30 years. And we see with February 24th, the invasion of Ukraine, a real, I think, inflection point in relations between Russia and the United States, and one that is going to last for a considerable period. And the Obama administration turns towards a very hard-edged form of containment, not only to isolate Russia, to punish Russia, but to try to turn Russia into an international pariah. And as we talked on Wednesday, to levy a set of sanctions that will cripple the Russian economy over the long term, prevent it from rebuilding the type of or generating the type of power it needs in order to conduct further offensive operations along its border to challenge the United States in cyberspace and so forth. Now, where this is going to end, how successful this policy will be, I think is an open question. We talked a little bit about that on Wednesday. My own view, as you know, is that while we have a need to deal with Russian aggression in Ukraine, to thwart the Russian initiative there, if we think longer term about our relationship with Russia, we still need over time to figure out a way to develop a constructive relationship with a country that is going to remain a pillar of the international order. And that requires perhaps some fine-tuning to the policy that the Biden administration is pursuing at the moment. So I've spoken long enough at this point. Let me end there, and I'm ready to take your questions.